Hi, everyone, and welcome to the last office hours of the Practical Ethics MOOC. It's been really great getting all the feedback from you, looking at the discussion forums and questions for office hours over the semester. So there's a last set of questions, and this time I'm taking questions from all over the course, any particular aspect of the course, not just what we've talked about in the last week or two. And it's been good to see that range of questions and range of interests. So the first question is from Doug Caro. It's a follow-up to the discussion of utilitarianism that we had in the last office hours. And Doug says, I believe you said that utilitarians include future generations in their calculations. How can this be done? If a future person is counted as equal to a presently alive person, then the future makes the present have negligible significance because the expected total of future persons, if we count for long enough, will be as many times larger than the present number as we want, unless some disaster occurs. If a future person is valued less than a presently alive person, then what weighting you choose determines how much the future is valued, and you can choose almost anything from nothing to almost nothing to almost everything. And Doug points out that economics has the same problem. They call it choosing the discount rate, and they say any plausible discount rate means that the distant future doesn't matter, and no discount rate at all means that the present doesn't matter. So how do you make the calculations with a time horizon of 50 years or 500 years or 5,000 years? Well, that's a good question, Doug, and I think there actually is a very straightforward answer that utilitarians take and have taken. It's very clearly stated by Henry Sidgwick, for example, and that is future people count equally. There is no discounting per se of the future. Now, when I say there's no discounting per se, that means if there's going to be a person in 5,000 years, and if we know for certain that that person will exist, and if we know for certain that we can have an impact on that person's happiness, that counts just as much as if we can have the same impact on a person's happiness tomorrow. But of course, we don't know that for certain. So although there's no discount per se, there is a discount for uncertainty. Nicholas Stern, in his climate report for the British government, pointed out, for example, that human beings might not survive even the next century. There could be a collision with a huge asteroid, or there could be some other kind of pandemic that wipes us out. So he had a very small discount rate. I think it might have been 0.5% for our survival over the next century. And of course, if you put that out over many centuries, you get a greater discount over time. And you also have to take account of the fact that we don't know which of our actions will or will not make people better off if you're talking about a time horizon of 500 years, let alone 5,000 years. We don't know what kind of technology there will be around. So it's very hard to know what could make somebody better off in 500 years or not. So I think that's the reason why the shadow of the future does not overwhelm the present. Another point that, since you mentioned economics, is it is reasonable to take into account the return rate on present investments if you're considering spending for the future. So it is reasonable to say, look, if we can invest something now with a return of 3%, let's say, when we discount the risks. Obviously, there are riskier investments with higher returns. Then there's an argument for saying we should invest now and we'll have more to use in the future, depending on how much more good we could do by spending it now. So the real rate of return is something that you can take into account as well. But I don't think there's any justification for discounting the future in itself any more than there's a justification for discounting geographical distance, let's say, and saying that the well-being of somebody who's 5,000 kilometers from me counts less than the well-being of someone who's 1 kilometer from me. And utilitarians certainly don't want to do that either. So this next question we have now is from Tom Burns in Melbourne, and he has asked that question through a video on Facebook. So let's hear it directly from Tom.
I have a question about utilitarianism and consequentialist theories. Some are deemed too demanding for people to accept, and one particular demanding this objection is to do with friendship. So can a consequentialist or utilitarian truly have friends? Seeing that friends or even family requires to treat someone partially, doesn't it sort of go against the grain of the impartiality of utilitarianism or consequentialism?
Thanks for that question, Tom. It's a good one, and it's certainly one that has been made against utilitarianism. I think, firstly, we ought to say that there's something in this, and as you say, it goes against the grain of the kind of impartiality that utilitarians favour, and that, in fact, I was just talking about in my response to Doug Caro about being impartial across time as well as across space. So do you have to be impartial between your friends or even your spouse or your children as compared with strangers? And if so, doesn't that mean that you don't really have friends? Because after all, being a friend to someone does mean that you show your concern about them in a way that you don't show your concern about strangers. Well, at one level, so you could imagine people saying, yes, all right, as a utilitarian, I shouldn't have friends or personal relationships, at least not ones that in which I give more weight to the interests of my friend or the person I'm in a relationship with than I do to anyone else. But here I think it's reasonable to look at what the consequences of that would be for yourself or for others who are trying to live like this. And I think you have to accept that our nature is such that we really need friends and personal relationships. Very, very few people could really function well without them. I know that I couldn't. The support of my family and people that I'm close to is really important. So I certainly do give more weight to their interests than I give to the interests of strangers. But I think by doing that, I've been able to do some things, perhaps not quite as much as I should have, but some significant things for the interest of strangers over a long period of time, over the past 45 years, if you like, since I became clear that I was philosophically a utilitarian and I should try to live, at least to some extent, in accordance with that. And I've seen a lot of people, say particularly because I'm involved in the animal liberation movement, I've seen people in the animal movement who come into the movement incredibly dedicated, putting aside everything for it. But very often they don't last long, unfortunately. They burn out within a few months or a year. And so perhaps if they had a bit more space to get away from the movement, if they had time to relax with friends, to think about friends, and had those sorts of relationships, which were not pushed into second place by their commitment to reducing animal suffering, they might have lasted 20 or 30 years in the movement and done a lot more good. So I think it's reasonable to have some concern for our own welfare and our own well-being and our own long-term impact. So what I'm saying really is that while there is some sense in which utilitarians ought to be impartial, you can, from an impartial perspective, justify the kind of partiality that is involved in having friends and close personal relationships. You can justify it both in terms of your own happiness and well-being of those of utilitarians who are involved in those relationships, and perhaps more importantly, ultimately, from the point of view of functioning as an effective utilitarian, an effective altruist, if you like, over the long run, which I think requires you to have that kind of stability and sense of well-being that friends and personal relationships are an important part of. So the next question is from Natalia, who's in Colombia. And we also have a video of Natalia's question.
If we say personhood is about being rational and self-aware, can we say that abortion wouldn't be exactly killing if it's done before the central nervous system is well developed? Thank you.
So Natalia, the way you put this question was whether abortion is killing if it is done before the central nervous system has been developed. And I would not put the question like that, because I think the question of whether something is or is not killing is a separate issue from the question of whether an act is or is not justifiable. It's almost as if you're assuming that if abortion is killing, then it's wrong, and therefore it's important to say that it's not killing until the central nervous system has been developed. But I would do it differently. I would say, yes, abortion is killing. In fact, even at a very early point, the destruction of an embryo, let's say an embryo produced by in vitro fertilization that consists still only of a single cell, I think that's killing too if you destroy that. Just as I think that, for instance, if you have a weed in the garden and you pull up that weed and you leave it to die in the sun without its roots being in the soil, you've killed that weed. But there's nothing wrong with killing that weed, of course. The weed is not capable of feeling pain, certainly doesn't have a central nervous system. And so we can say that that's killing, but we can say that it's justified. So the question in the case of the fetus is whether the same is true, whether we can say that the killing is justified, and whether it's the development of the central nervous system that is crucial to whether it is or is not justified. So I do think that if a woman is pregnant and does not wish to be pregnant, that it is justifiable for her to end the life of the fetus before the central nervous system is developed. Because the fetus is not going to be capable of feeling anything from that. It's not going to be capable of feeling pain. And I don't think its potential is enough to say that it is wrong to end its life. As I think I said in the lecture when we discussed abortion, I think to say that it's wrong to kill it because of its potential would have the implication that we ought to bring more beings into the world. I think the relevance of potential is only if we want beings like this to exist. And so if it's wrong to kill a fetus because of its potential, it would be wrong to decide not to conceive a fetus when you could conceive one, because that would have the same effect, that there would be another person in the world. And I don't think that's wrong. And actually, there's another question I'm going to talk about in this office hours about the population issue. So, so my answer is, yes, it's killing, but no, it's not wrong. But it may not be only the question of the development of the central nervous system that is relevant, and that's going to be the case in the next question that I'm going to ask, which comes from Monica Beveridge, and she's asking about questions about what is in the interests of beings. She asks a question about what is it that makes something an interest and what is it that makes something a mechanism. And she mentions the principle of equal consideration of interests, which of course I think is the basis of how we ought to treat other living organisms. But she says that she thinks there's something slightly random, as she puts it, between what we think is an actual interest and what is a mechanism. And she discusses this in the context of newborn infants because she's spent time in labour wards and in neonatal intensive care units where newborn infants with problems or very premature ones are looked after. And she says there's not very much that differentiates the fetus from the newborn. If we're talking about, the very new newborn, she says literally the 5-second-old newborn, there's not much growth of neural tissue in the first few moments after birth. And of course, I agree with that. But then she says she thinks that there are various interests in the newborn, which she values, and they include things like the interest in having food, warmth, close skin contact, avoiding pain and unpleasant sensations, and so on. And she says, well, if there are those interests in the newborn, and there's not much difference between the newborn and the fetus, then surely there are those interests in the fetus too, at least certainly you could say the late fetus, not maybe early in pregnancy. And obviously those interests can only be fulfilled if the fetus is alive, so why don't they count? Well, I do think that there are interests in the newborn of the kind that you mentioned, and I think that, again, if we're talking about the late fetus, well, some of those interests probably apply, although obviously the fetus doesn't obtain food through the mouth in the same way. The fetus is already warm inside the mother's body, and so on. So, yeah, some of the interests would be similar, and some of them would be somewhat different because of the different circumstances. So we can recognize that the fetus or the newborn infant has these interests in satisfying present desires, like for food or to be warm, and that it's going to suffer if it doesn't have them. But I think that's different from a self-aware being who can see themselves as living over time and can have a desire to do things in future which would be thwarted by ending that being's life, in a way that for a newborn, you don't thwart these interests. The newborn has a present interest, if you like, you could say an interest while alive, while feeling this need for food or for warmth, to have food and warmth. But it's not an interest that the newborn is capable of projecting into the future or thinking about its future. So it's more like, if you like, the basic interest of non-human animals, which, at least those non-human animals that are not capable of thinking themselves as existing over time. I think some of them are, but some of them probably are not. And I don't think that they have a right to life either as such, although I do think it's really wrong to make them suffer. So I think something similar is what we ought to say about the late stage fetus or the newborn infant, that it has interest in not suffering, but it does not have an interest in continued existence because it's not capable of thinking about its existence as a whole and projecting itself into the future and wishing to do things that are in the future. The next question is from Isla Kangur. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing all of these names well. And Isla is asking about my thoughts on having children in our current society. Isla says, personally, I cannot think of an ethical argument that supports this decision. To explain my reasoning, first, there are more persons on Earth right now than we can effectively manage, and adding another person will only increase the stress we're putting on the Earth's resources, like food, water, energy, minerals. Second, raising a child costs an incredible amount of time and money, which could have had a greater effect if they'd been spent on those already existing in need and on developing innovations that solve global problems. And thirdly, with future predictions on the effect of climate change, then there's a chance that this child will endure a lot more suffering and hardship than I wish for anyone to endure. So given these circumstances and realizing that most other people will continue to have children, Isla asks, can it be ethical to choose to have a child? Well, I agree that this is a major question that needs to be faced, but I think there's something interesting implied in your very last sentence. Remember, you said, given these circumstances and realizing that most other people will continue to have children, can it be ethical to choose to have a child? So what are the choices here? You're addressing people who are thinking ethically, and you're asking them to consider whether it would be ethical for them in view of the world population problems and other serious issues, whether it would be ethical for them to choose to have a child. And you're recognizing that there's going to be a lot of other people who are not going to think about this question at all, or who, if they do think about it, perhaps they're going to have religious grounds for thinking that it's wrong to not have children, and are going to go on having children. So if the answer were to be no, a person who thinks about the ethical considerations should not have children, the outcome of that would be that the world would be populated exclusively with the children of people who either don't care about ethics at all, or have religious beliefs that require them to continue to have large families. And I think that would be more disastrous than for ethical people to continue to have children, because I do think that how your child is significantly influenced by how you are. Whether that's through genetics or whether that's through the early upbringing is another question, but it's going to be one or the other, or probably both. So I think if we want to have children in future generations who are going to think about how can we ethically solve our problems, it's important that people who think ethically do choose to have children. Just a couple of reflections on the other things that you said. I certainly think that climate change is a huge problem, as I've said in the course, and that we have to find ways of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. I think over the longer term, we'll be able to do that. Whether we'll be able to do it in time, I don't know. And so there certainly could be a significant amount of suffering caused by climate change and its consequences. But will it be so much suffering that life is not worth living? Because, of course, the children, if we decide not to have children, those children will not exist at all. I don't think you can confidently say that. It's quite possible, especially for people who are reasonably affluent, living in developed societies, that life will be worth living, even if it has more hardships than life at present, and even if perhaps it all ends badly, and life is shorter than it is now. So that's one factor. Is the world already overpopulated? That's a controversial question. I don't know, but I agree that it's the way it's heading. We do need to reduce population growth, or it soon will be overpopulated. And in terms of how much time and money it costs, well, yeah, it certainly does take some time and money. But as I say, you're putting that into a future person who hopefully will be doing something good in their life. And in that sense, it will be an investment in a more ethical future. Next is a video question, and it's from Shane Drumgold. Shane asked this question on Facebook.
My question relates to the ethical production of food. It seems to me inescapable that to increase the ethical nature of the production of food will equally increase the cost of that production, making it less accessible to the economically marginalised. So effectively what we've got is a balance between improving the quality of the short life of a food production animal against shortening the life of an economically marginalised person. Just wondering how you reconcile these two competing forces. Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much, Shane. I don't really agree that more ethical food production necessarily raises costs. You were clearly thinking in that question of animal production, and I think that it's certainly true that to raise animals organically is more expensive than raising them in factory farms, and that's the economic tragedy that has led to so much suffering by tens of billions of animals being confined in factory farms. But the most ethical of all ways of eating, I think, is not to be eating animal products, to eat a vegan diet. And so then the question of the cost of raising animals simply doesn't arise. Now, you could ask whether that's really going to be feasible for everyone. I think it is going to be feasible for a lot of people. And we may, of course, in future find ways of producing meat at the cellular level in the laboratory, which would be less expensive than producing meat by other methods and more environmentally friendly. So that's also a future possibility. But for people who, let's say, for some reason or another, can't be completely vegan, can't get the wide range of foods that you would need, they could eat small quantities of free-ranging animal products, or products from free-ranging animals, perhaps I should say, to avoid the impression that the eggs themselves are ranging around the country. I don't think that's going to be very costly. It's clearly not going to be possible to continue to consume the amount of animal products that people do now, but that's undesirable for the environment as well as for the animals, and not desirable for people's health either. You might then say, well, what about more ethical production of plant crops, which I think would probably mean growing them organically. That's somewhat more expensive, certainly more labor involved, but perhaps is more sustainable in the long run, improving the soil and using fewer chemicals and so on. So that's perhaps a more difficult one, but I think it's possible again, and I don't think it's really a question of shortening anyone's life to say that food production should be more ethical. The next question is by Neboiser, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and it's on the ethics of having a pet. And Neboiser says that there's quite a lot been said and written about the use of animals for food and clothing, but not so much about animals as pets. And there are a lot of pets in the world, 164 million in the US alone, according to one source. They compete with humans and non-human animals for scarce resources like clean water, food, and so on. And if we had fewer animals for pets, that would decrease the problems of environmental degradation. People spend a lot of money on their pets. Americans spend more than $50 billion on their cats, dogs, and other animal companions in 2012. This could be used for improving the lives of either people or animals. Pets are typically fed with the carcasses of other animals, which is a way of supporting factory farming by feeding your pet. And Neboiser suggests that people who have a need for companions could adopt or sponsor an orphaned child rather than a pet. She says, however, if pets give them feelings of fulfillment or anything else that raising a being can give, they are less likely to commit their time, energy, and resources to raising a child. And Neboiser concludes by saying there doesn't seem to be very much discussion of this. So, well, there has been some discussion in some animal circles you can probably find around the web if you search for it, but certainly much less than there is for food animals. But that is because it is a much, much smaller problem. You know, you mentioned this figure of 164 million animals, pets in the United States. That sounds like a big figure, but compare it to more than 10 billion animals being killed in food production in the United States each year, and it's 1.5% of the total number of animals used for food. So it's really pretty small in comparison. And of course, from an animal welfare point of view, the pets generally do have much better lives than the factory farm animals. So I think that's probably why it's had less attention in the animal welfare movement. It is a tiny problem compared with the food problem, although it's quite a big problem in itself. So of the points that you made, I think it's true that it's a problem that most pets are fed with meat. That's because the pets most people have are cats and dogs, and they do eat meat, although it's not difficult to raise dogs as vegetarians. It's much more difficult to raise cats as vegetarians. So there is a problem, and I would suggest to people that if they want to have a pet, they should consider a non-carnivorous animal as a pet. And there are various possibilities there, hamsters and guinea pigs, rabbits, for example. And when my children were small, we got them some ex-laboratory rats, which were very good companions, I have to say. People have negative images of rats as being dirty or nasty or something like that, but actually they keep themselves pretty clean if you give them the circumstances in which they can do so. They don't carry diseases any more than any other animals if they haven't come out of the sewers, obviously. They're quite affectionate. They like to run around you when you're sitting there. They like to wriggle up your jumper, and if you have a rat, it will sort of could run up my jumper and come out the top here and sit on my shoulder. They are they can be completely vegetarian. They'll eat meat if you give them to them, but you can just raise them on grains and things like that. They do perfectly well. So I think that's an option. They're much less expensive to feed, of course, than dogs and cats as well. Now you suggest that maybe it's better not to have pets at all, and you could adopt or sponsor an orphan child. Well, sponsoring an orphan child, that is, sending the money, is not actually the most effective form of charity if you want to help the global poor. We talked about that, and I mentioned GiveWell and the charities they rate. I think you do better giving your money to one of their top-rated organizations. As for adopting one, it's not so easy to adopt a child. There's lots of families that want to adopt children. Perhaps older children or disabled children can be adopted, and if you're willing to do that, then that's a good thing to do. But I think there's a lot of people who would be prepared to have a pet who would not be prepared to spend the time and commitment that would involve. So I hope that gives you an answer to quite a complicated question. Thanks very much for raising it. Now we're coming to the final question of the final office hours, which is from Matthew Dahlhausen. And Matthew says, this course considered ethical theories, abortion, euthanasia, effective altruism, climate change, animal rights, environmental values, and affirmative action. It's a good summary of what we talked about. What are some other important ethical considerations that weren't considered in the course? Are there any emerging ethical considerations that we can expect to see debated in the future? Well, there's certainly some issues that we didn't talk about. Sometimes when I've taught this course at Princeton in previous years, I've talked about ethics and war, and I saw someone else in a discussion forum asked why we hadn't talked about that. It's partly that I don't feel I've got anything very distinctive to say about it. The years that I did talk about it was when around the years when America was at war in Iraq, and there was a lot of controversy about that particular war, which America is no longer involved in, and there is still the war in Afghanistan. I don't know that I have a lot to say about it from an ethical perspective that you wouldn't easily find in a range of different issues, but it's a possibility. The death penalty is another thing that people bring up, again, especially in the United States. It's one of the countries that has the death penalty and, in fact, executes more people than I think pretty much any other country except China, but I'm not quite sure about that. Then you talk about emerging ethical considerations. I think there are questions about in bioethics that are emerging. For example, we're going to have increased possibilities of genetically selecting our children. We can already do it to some extent by using in vitro fertilization and then doing genetic examinations of the resulting embryos and only implanting those that do not have some genetic defect. This is a technique that's done in couples where they carry a gene for a serious genetic defect. But as we learn more about genes, including genes that we regard as desirable, like genes that are related to scholarly aptitude, if you like, to intelligence, or the kinds of abilities that are likely to get you to be successful in your education, I think we will discover some genes that are at least relevant to that, maybe not completely determinate, but are relevant to it, increase the chances that you'll do well and get into a good university. We're going to have to debate the ethics of genetic selection. I think that's going to be an important issue. And many people think that we ought to debate the development of artificial intelligence and what is likely to happen as we develop what's been called superintelligence. We develop intelligent machines that are smarter than us, and perhaps we'll have the ability then even to manufacture still smarter machines. Is there a major ethical dilemma about whether we should do this, whether we can control this, and if so, how we might be able to do it? And another issue that is important and also relates to the future and perhaps relates to the issue I just talked about that we haven't really talked about is the ethics of reducing the risks of human extinction. I mentioned that risk before in regard to the question about discounting the future. A number of people think that it's would be really important to invest more resources in trying to make sure that our species does survive and that we do whatever we can to reduce anything that carries a risk of extinction. That might include extreme climate change scenarios, could also include tracking asteroids that might collide with our planet and finding ways to deflect them if we find one that is on track to collide, and could include trying to reduce risks of pandemics. And as I mentioned, at least some people think this ought to include reducing the risk of us being taken over by intelligent machines that are hostile to us. So on that futuristic note, I'm going to end this office hours. I really would like to hear back from as many as possible of you about what you thought of the course. So watch out for the survey that we are putting out, and please do respond to it as fully and carefully as you can. Thank you again, everyone who's watching this, for your part in the course. I've enjoyed teaching it. I hope that you've enjoyed taking it and have learned things from it. And perhaps we'll have the opportunity to take another course online together in some future year. Goodbye.